The Runaway Toy Car. Benny and Oliver were best friends, and their favorite thing in the world was racing their toy cars. Vroom, zoom, whoosh! They built ramps, made obstacle courses, and had the fastest races ever. But one day, something unexpected happened. Benny's toy car rolled too far and into the street. Before Benny could run after it, a friendly police officer stopped him just in time. "Whoa there, buddy! The road is not a place to play," the officer said. And that's how Benny and Oliver's big road safety adventure began. They learned all about crossing the street, stop signs, traffic lights, bike safety, stranger danger, and even what to do in bad weather. But the biggest lesson of all? Listening to safety rules keeps everyone safe. So buckle up and get ready for an exciting journey where Benny and Oliver learn how to be smart, careful, and road-safe kids. Let's go! Benny and Oliver were having the best day ever. They had set up a huge racetrack on the sidewalk, using wooden planks for ramps and chalk to draw twisty roads. Vroom, vroom! Here comes the speed champion! Benny cheered as he sent his fastest toy car zooming down a ramp. Oliver laughed and made his car go too, but whoosh! Benny's car was too fast! It zipped off the ramp, rolled across the sidewalk, and right onto the street. "Oh no! My car!" Benny cried, running after it. But just as he reached the edge of the sidewalk, a strong but gentle hand stopped him. "Whoa there, buddy!" said a friendly police officer with a kind smile. "We never run into the street like that. Cars might not see you." Benny blinked and looked up. The officer pointed at the road. A big car zoomed past whoosh, right where Benny was about to step. Benny gasped and held onto Oliver's hand. "I just wanted my car," Benny mumbled. "I understand," said the officer, kneeling down to his level. "But streets are for real cars, not toy cars. You always have to stop, look, and listen before stepping off the sidewalk." Benny gulped. "I didn't think about that." The officer smiled. "That's okay. I can help you get your car safely." He picked up a long stick from nearby and carefully pushed the toy car back toward Benny. "Whoa! That was cool," Oliver said. Benny picked up his car and held it tight. "Thanks, officer," he said. The officer winked. "Anytime, but I have a few more safety tips for you two." Benny and Oliver looked at each other with wide eyes. More safety tips? This was getting interesting. Benny held his toy car tight. His heart was still beating fast. He didn't know the street was so dangerous. The friendly police officer smiled and said, "Let's talk about how to cross the street safely." Benny and Oliver nodded. They wanted to learn. The officer pointed at the road. "When you need to cross, first, you stop at the edge of the sidewalk," he said. Benny and Oliver stood still. "Like this?" Benny asked. "Just like that," the officer said with a thumbs up. "Next, you look both ways. That means looking left." The boys turned their heads left. Then looking right, they turned their heads right. And then looking left again. The boys looked left one more time. "Why do we look so much?" Oliver asked. "Because cars come fast, and we need to make sure no cars are coming from any side," the officer said. "Then what?" Benny asked. "Now we listen," the officer said. "Sometimes you hear a car before you see it. You listen for engines, honks, or brakes." Benny and Oliver stood very still and listened. Vroom! A car zoomed by. "I hear one," Benny said. "Good job," the officer said. "That's why we always listen before stepping off the sidewalk." Benny nodded. He liked learning safety rules. "And if a car is coming, we wait, right?" he asked. "That's right," the officer said. "If no cars are coming, and it's safe, then you walk, not run to the other side." Benny and Oliver practiced with the officer. They stopped, looked, and listened before stepping onto the pretend road. "This is fun," Oliver said. "It's also very important," the officer said. "Now, let's talk about crosswalks." Benny's eyes got big. "What's a crosswalk?" he asked. "Come with me and I'll show you," the officer said. Benny and Oliver followed him, excited to learn more. Benny and Oliver followed the officer to the corner of the street. The officer pointed to the big white stripes painted on the road. See these lines? This is a crosswalk. It's the safest place to cross the street, he said. Benny's eyes widened. It looks like a giant zebra, he giggled. The officer chuckled. That's why some people call it a zebra crossing. Oliver tapped his chin. So, if we walk on the stripes, the cars stop for us? The officer nodded. That's right, but we still have to be careful. We always wait for the walk signal before crossing. He pointed at a small light near the road. It had a red hand glowing. See this red hand? That means stop. Benny frowned. What if I really, really want to go? You still have to wait, the officer said kindly. Cars won't stop if it's not your turn. Benny nodded. He didn't want to get hurt. What happens next? The officer smiled and pointed at the light again. The red hand turned into a walking person. Now it's time to cross, he said. Benny and Oliver watched closely. A few people started walking on the stripes. Whoa, it's like the road knows when to let us go, Oliver said. That's why it's so important to listen to the signals, the officer said. Now, let's practice. Benny and Oliver waited at the crosswalk. The red hand was still up. Not yet, Benny whispered. Then, ding, the walking person appeared. Now we go, Oliver cheered. They walked across the stripes, step by step. No running, no skipping, just walking safely. When they reached the other side, Benny grinned. That was fun! Great job, boys, the officer said. Now you know how to cross the street safely. Always use the crosswalk when you can. Benny and Oliver felt proud. They were learning so much. What else can we learn today? Benny asked. The officer smiled. How about we talk about stop signs next? Whew, Benny and Oliver said together. They loved learning with their new friend. Benny and Oliver followed the officer down the sidewalk. The sun was shining, and a little breeze made the leaves dance. Now, let's talk about something very important, the officer said. He stopped and pointed to a big red sign at the corner. It had 4 big white letters, S-T-O-P. Benny tilted his head. I see those signs everywhere. Oliver scratched his head. What does it do? The officer smiled. This is a stop sign. It tells cars they have to stop before going. Benny's eyes got big. Like how we stop at the sidewalk before crossing. Exactly, the officer said. Drivers must stop, look, and make sure the road is clear before moving again, just like you do when you cross the street. Oliver grinned. So cars have to follow safety rules too? Yes, everyone follows safety rules to keep people safe, the officer said. Just then, a blue car came toward the stop sign. Benny and Oliver watched closely. The car slowed down and stopped right at the sign. The driver looked left, then right, then left again. When the road was clear, the car started moving slowly. Wow, Benny said. That car did the same thing we did at the crosswalk. That's right, the officer said. But sometimes, drivers don't pay attention. That's why you always have to look before crossing, even if there's a stop sign. Benny and Oliver nodded. They understood now. What if a driver doesn't stop? Benny asked. That's why we never run into the street, the officer said. We always wait and make sure the car really stops before we go. Benny thought about his toy car rolling into the street. I almost ran after my car today, he said softly. The officer gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. But now you know better, and that's what makes you smart and safe. Benny smiled. He liked being smart and safe. Oliver pointed down the road. What's that other sign over there? The officer looked and grinned. That's a school zone sign. It means drivers have to go extra slow. Want to go check it out? Yes, Benny and Oliver cheered. They were excited to learn more about safety. Benny and Oliver walked with the officer toward the new sign. It was big, yellow, and had a picture of 2 kids walking. This is a school zone sign, the officer said. Benny tilted his head. What does that mean? It means this area is near a school, so drivers have to slow down and be extra careful, the officer explained. There are lots of kids walking here, just like you two. Oliver pointed to the road. Look, the speed limit is smaller here. That's right, the officer said. In a school zone, cars must drive very slow so they have time to stop if someone is crossing. Benny thought about it. So, if a car is going too fast, it might not stop in time? Exactly, the officer said. That's why it's important for drivers to always follow the speed limit, especially near schools. Just then, a car came down the road. Benny and Oliver watched closely. As soon as the car reached the school zone, it slowed down and drove carefully past the sign. See how that car slowed down? The officer said. That's what good drivers do. Benny smiled. I like good drivers. Oliver grinned. Me too. But suddenly, vroom! A red car zoomed past way too fast. Benny gasped. That car didn't slow down. The officer frowned. That driver is not being safe. If I were in my police car, I'd pull them over and remind them to follow the rules. Oliver's eyes widened. You can do that? The officer nodded. Yes, police officers help keep the roads safe by making sure drivers follow the rules. Benny crossed his arms. I wish all drivers followed the rules. Me too, the officer said. That's why we teach kids like you about safety, so when you grow up, you will be safe drivers. Benny and Oliver smiled. They were learning so much today. Can we learn more? Benny asked. The officer grinned. Of course! Next, let's talk about traffic lights. Ooh, traffic lights! Benny and Oliver cheered as they followed the officer to their next lesson. Benny and Oliver followed the officer to the corner of the street. A tall pole stood there with 3 big lights on red, 1 yellow, and 1 green. Benny's eyes sparkled. I know what this is! It's a traffic light! That's right, the officer said. It helps cars and people know when to go, slow down, or stop. Oliver pointed to the top light. Red means stop. Correct, the officer said. When the red light is on, all cars must stop completely. Benny pointed to the bottom light. And green means go. Right again, the officer said. When the green light turns on, cars can go, but only if the road is clear. Benny looked at the middle light. What about the yellow one? Good question, the officer said. Yellow means slow down. It tells drivers the red light is coming soon, so they should get ready to stop. Benny grinned. It's like the traffic light is talking to the cars. The officer laughed. That's a great way to think about it. The traffic light gives instructions so everyone knows what to do. Just then, the light turned yellow. A big white truck slowed down. Then click. The light changed to red, and the truck stopped. Wow, it really listens, Oliver said. The officer nodded. Yes, but some drivers don't pay attention, and that's why we always have to look before crossing the street. Benny watched the traffic light. It turned green, and the cars started moving again. Oliver tilted his head. But what about people? How do we know when to cross? Great question, the officer said. He pointed to a smaller traffic light on the side of the pole. It had a red hand on it. This is a pedestrian signal. When the red hand is up, that means don't walk. Benny nodded. Like a big stop sign for people. The officer smiled. Exactly. But when the red hand goes away and you see a little walking person, that means it's safe to cross. Benny and Oliver watched carefully. A few seconds later, the red hand disappeared, and a little white walking person appeared. It's time to go, Oliver cheered. The officer smiled. That's right, but remember, even when the walk signal is on, always stop, look, and listen before stepping onto the road. Benny and Oliver practiced waiting, looking both ways, and then walking carefully across the street. When they reached the other side, Benny grinned. That was fun! You're both great listeners, the officer said. Now, how about I tell you what happens when someone doesn't follow the rules? Benny's eyes got big. Ooh, yes, what happens? The officer chuckled. Let's go find out. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited to learn more. Benny and Oliver followed the officer down the sidewalk, their toy cars tucked under their arms. So, what happens when someone doesn't follow the rules? Benny asked. The officer smiled. Well, let's talk about that. When drivers don't stop at red lights, go too fast, or don't watch for people, they can cause accidents. Benny's eyes widened. Like a big crash? Sometimes, the officer said. That's why police officers help keep everyone safe. If a driver breaks the rules, we can stop them and give them a ticket. Oliver tilted his head. What's a ticket? A ticket is like a big reminder that they did something wrong, the officer explained. It tells them they have to follow the rules or they'll get in trouble. Benny gasped. What kind of trouble? Well, the officer said, sometimes they have to pay money as a punishment, and if they break the rules too many times, they might not be allowed to drive anymore. Benny's mouth dropped open. Whoa, I bet that makes them listen. The officer nodded. That's the goal. We don't want to punish people, we just want them to be safe. Just then honk! Honk! A car sped past the stop sign without stopping. Oh no! Oliver pointed. That car didn't stop. Benny looked up at the officer. Are you going to give them a ticket? The officer smiled. If I was in my police car, I would turn on my lights and siren woo-woo and stop them. Benny giggled. I'd love to see that. The officer winked. Maybe later, but for now, let's remember that rules are for everyone drivers, bikers, and walkers like you. Benny nodded. And if we all follow the rules, we stay safe. Exactly, the officer said. Oliver grinned. What can we learn next? The officer tapped his chin. How about learning about emergency numbers? Benny clapped his hands. Oh yes, what number do we call for help? The officer smiled. Let's go find out. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, ready for their next adventure. Benny and Oliver walked beside the officer, their toy cars bouncing in their hands. So, what number do we call if there's an emergency? Benny asked excitedly. The officer smiled. That's a very important question. If something bad happens and you need help fast, you call 911-1. Benny's eyes got big. Just 3 numbers? That's easy. Oliver tilted his head. But what counts as an emergency? The officer knelt down to their level. An emergency is when someone is hurt, in danger, or needs help right away. Like if there's a fire, a car crash, or someone is really sick. Benny nodded slowly. So, I don't call 911-1 if I lose my toy car? The officer chuckled. That's right, we only call for big problems, not little ones. Oliver tapped his chin. What if I see someone in trouble but I don't know what to do? The officer gave him a thumbs up. Great question. If you ever feel unsure but someone needs help, you can still call 911-1. The operator, the person who answers the phone, will ask questions and send the right kind of help. Benny's eyes sparkled. What kind of help? Well, the officer said, if there's a fire, they send firefighters. If someone is hurt, they send paramedics. And if there's danger, they send police officers like me. Benny grinned. That's so cool. But what do I say when I call? The officer pointed at Benny's chest. The most important thing is to stay calm and tell them 3 things. Who you are, where you are, and what's happening. Oliver nodded. So, I say my name, my location, and the problem? Exactly, the officer said. And never hang up until they say it's okay. Benny felt proud. I can do that. I want to be a helper too. The officer smiled. You are a helper. Learning this makes you a safety hero. Benny and Oliver high-fived. They liked being safety heroes. Oliver grinned. What should we learn next? The officer thought for a moment, then he smiled. How about bike safety? Do you 2 ride bikes? Benny and Oliver's faces lit up. Yes, they cheered. Great, the officer said. Then let's go learn how to ride safely. The boys raced ahead, excited for their next lesson. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited to learn about bike safety. The officer smiled as he caught up with them. So, who here loves riding bikes? Me! Benny and Oliver cheered, bouncing on their feet. The officer chuckled. That's great, but riding a bike means following rules, just like when we walk or drive. Benny tilted his head. Bikes have rules too. Of course, the officer said. Because bikes go fast, just like cars, we have to be extra careful. Oliver grinned. What's the most important rule? The officer tapped his helmet. Always wear a helmet. Benny groaned. But helmets are so itchy. The officer nodded. I know they might feel funny, but helmets protect your head. If you fall, a helmet helps keep you safe. Oliver pointed at his toy car. It's like a seatbelt for your head. Exactly, the officer said. And guess what? If you pick a cool helmet, it makes you look like a real racer. Benny's eyes sparkled. I want a blue one with lightning bolts. Oliver giggled. I want one with dinosaurs. The officer laughed. Those sound awesome. Now, what else do you think is important? Benny scratched his head. Watching where you go? Good thinking, the officer said. You should always watch where you're going and never ride too fast where you can't stop in time. Oliver nodded. And stay on the sidewalk, right? The officer smiled. Actually, in some places, bikes go on the bike lane or the road, not the sidewalk. Benny gasped. On the road? But what about the cars? That's why we follow more safety rules, the officer said. When riding on the road, always stay to the side. Ride in the same direction as cars, and look for stop signs and traffic lights just like a driver. Oliver thought for a second. What if I need to turn? Great question, the officer said. Bikers use hand signals. If you want to turn left, you stick your left arm straight out. If you want to turn right, you bend your left arm up like an L. Benny practiced making an L with his arm. Like this? Perfect, the officer said. And if you need to stop, just put your arm down like this. He showed them how to hold his arm straight down. Benny and Oliver copied him. This is fun, Benny giggled. The officer nodded. It is fun, but the most important thing is to stay alert. Watch for cars, people, and always stop at intersections. Oliver grinned. I can be a super safe biker. Benny pumped his fist in the air. Me too. I'll wear my lightning helmet and follow all the rules. The officer smiled. That's what I like to hear. Now, how about we talk about what to do if we ever get lost? Benny and Oliver stopped bouncing. Ooh, that sounds important. Then let's go learn, the officer said. The boys grabbed their toy cars and followed him eagerly, ready for their next lesson. Benny and Oliver walked beside the officer, holding their toy cars tight. So, what do we do if we ever get lost? Benny asked. That's a very important question, the officer said. Sometimes kids get lost in big stores, parks, or crowded places. But don't worry, there are smart ways to stay safe and get help. Oliver bit his lip. I got lost in the grocery store once. I couldn't find my mom. Benny gasped. What did you do? Oliver looked at the officer. I stood still and waited. My mom told me to never run around if I'm lost. The officer gave him a thumbs up. That was very smart. If you ever get lost, the best thing to do is stay where you are. Running can make it harder for your family to find you. Benny nodded. Okay, but what if nobody comes? The officer smiled. That's when you ask for help, but only from a safe adult. Oliver tilted his head. Who is a safe adult? A police officer, a store worker, a teacher, or a parent with kids, the officer said. People who wear uniforms are usually the best to ask. Benny thought for a moment. So, if I'm in a store, I can ask a worker? Exactly, the officer said. If you see someone with a name tag or a uniform, they can help. Oliver's eyes widened. What do I say? The officer said, Tell them I'm lost. My name is Oliver, and I need help finding my grown-up. Benny practiced. I'm lost. My name is Benny, and I need help finding my mom or dad. Perfect, the officer said. And never leave with a stranger. Stay in a safe spot until your family finds you. Oliver tapped his chin. What if I'm outside, like at the park? If you're outside, look for a police officer or find a safe place, like a fire station or a school, the officer said. And if you have a phone, you can call 9-121F for help. Benny grinned. I remember. I say my name, my location, and what's wrong. The officer nodded. That's right. But the best way to not get lost is to stay close to your grown-up and pay attention. Oliver smiled. I'll always stay close now. Benny held his toy car. Me too! No more getting lost! The officer clapped his hands. You both learned so much today. Now, how about we talk about fire safety? Benny's eyes got big. Ooh, like firefighters? The officer grinned. Yes, let's go learn what to do if there's ever a fire. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited for their next safety lesson. Benny and Oliver followed the officer as they walked toward a fire station. So, what do we do if there's a fire? Benny asked, holding his toy car tight. The officer smiled. That's a great question. Fires can be dangerous, but if you know what to do, you can stay safe. Oliver tilted his head. What's the first rule? The officer held up a finger. First rule, get out, stay out, and never go back inside. Benny gasped. Not even for my favorite toy? The officer shook his head. Not even for your toy. Fire spreads very fast, and smoke makes it hard to see and breathe. The most important thing is to get outside right away. Oliver nodded. Okay, what if the door is hot? Great question, the officer said. Before opening a door, always touch it with the back of your hand. If it's hot, that means there's fire on the other side and you should find another way out. Benny's eyes got big. What if all the doors are hot? Then you stay low to the ground and go to a window, the officer said. Smoke rises, so crawling keeps you in cleaner air. If you can, open the window and wave something bright to get help. Oliver thought for a second. Who do we call if there's a fire? Always call 921-1, the officer said. Tell them your name, address, and that there's a fire. Benny looked up. What if we don't have a phone? The officer smiled. That's why it's super important to have a family escape plan. That means knowing 2 ways out of every room and having a meeting spot outside like a big tree or a mailbox where everyone can find each other. Oliver gasped. We have a big tree in our front yard. We could meet there. Benny grinned. We have a mailbox. That could be our spot. The officer nodded. Those are great meeting spots. You should practice fire drills at home so everyone knows what to do. Oliver's eyes widened. Like the fire drills we do at school? Exactly, the officer said. When the smoke alarm beeps, you stop what you're doing and get out fast. Benny looked up. Wait, what's a smoke alarm? The officer pointed at a building nearby. It's a small round alarm on the ceiling that beeps really loud when it senses smoke. Benny covered his ears. Is it louder than a police siren? The officer chuckled. It's pretty loud, but it helps wake you up if a fire happens at night. Oliver nodded. That's good. Fires are scary. The officer knelt down. They can be scary, but if you know what to do, you'll be safe. Benny grinned. I feel like a fire safety hero. Oliver giggled. Me too. The officer smiled. You both are. Now, how about we learn about stranger danger next? Benny's eyes got big. Ooh, what do we do if a stranger talks to us? The officer stood up. Let's go find out. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited for their next important lesson. Benny and Oliver followed the officer to a quiet park with a playground. So, what should we do if a stranger talks to us? Benny asked, gripping his toy car tightly. The officer knelt down. That's a very important question. First, do you know what a stranger is? Oliver thought for a second. A stranger is someone we don't know? Exactly, the officer said. Not all strangers are bad, but some might try to trick kids, so we always have to be careful. Benny nodded. Okay, but what if a stranger seems nice? That's the tricky part, the officer said. Some strangers act nice to get kids to trust them. They might say things like, one day, can you help me find my lost puppy? 2, I'd have candy in my car. 3, Den, your parents told me to pick you up. Benny gasped. But what if they really lost a puppy? The officer shook his head. Adults should ask other adults for help, not kids. Oliver's eyes widened. So we should never go with a stranger? Never, the officer said. If a stranger talks to you, you should stay far away and never go anywhere with them. Benny gulped. What if they try to grab me? Great question, the officer said. If a stranger ever tries to grab you, you yell, kick, and run. Make a lot of noise and shout, Help! This is not my parent! Help! I don't know this person! Oliver practiced. Help! This is not my parent. The officer smiled. Great job! Loud noises scare bad people away. Benny tilted his head. What if I'm not sure if someone is a bad stranger? The officer nodded. If you ever feel uncomfortable, trust your feelings. It's always okay to say no and walk away. Oliver thought for a moment. But what if I get lost and need help? Good question, the officer said. If you need help, look for a safe adult, like a police officer, store worker, teacher, or a parent with kids. Benny grinned. Like you! The officer chuckled. Yes, police officers are always here to help. Oliver smiled. We learned so much today. Benny nodded. Yeah, and I'll always remember strangers are tricky, but I am smart and safe. The officer gave them a high five. That's what I like to hear. Now, how about we learn what to do if someone bullies us? Oliver's face got serious. Oh, bullying is not nice. Benny frowned. Yeah, what should we do if someone is mean to us? The officer smiled. Let's go talk about it. Benny and Oliver followed him, ready for their next lesson. Benny and Oliver followed the officer as dark clouds gathered in the sky. The wind started to blow and a few raindrops splashed on the sidewalk. Uh-oh, it looks like a storm is coming, Benny said, hugging his toy car. The officer nodded. That's a great time to talk about road safety and bad weather. Do you know what happens when it rains a lot? Oliver thought for a second. The roads get wet? Exactly, the officer said. When roads are wet, cars can slide if they go too fast. That's why drivers need to slow down and be extra careful. Benny tilted his head. What if it's really, really stormy? If it's stormy, foggy, or too dark, drivers should turn on their headlights so other cars can see them, the officer said. And if it's too dangerous to drive, it's safest to pull over and wait until the storm passes. Oliver pointed at a big puddle on the road. What about big puddles? Great question, the officer said. Puddles can be deeper than they look. Cars should never drive through flooded streets because the water can carry them away. Benny gasped. That sounds scary. It can be, the officer said. That's why the rule is, turn around, don't drown. If a road is flooded, drivers should find another way. Oliver looked up. What about people walking? If you're walking or biking in the rain, always wear bright colors so cars can see you, the officer said. And never run across wet roads. Cars take longer to stop when the ground is slippery. Benny nodded. So if it's raining, we should walk carefully, wear bright clothes, and wait for cars to stop before crossing. The officer smiled. That's right! You boys are becoming road safety experts! Oliver grinned. I feel ready for any kind of weather. Benny pumped his fist. Me too! What can we learn next? The officer chuckled. How about one last surprise? Benny's eyes sparkled. A surprise? What is it? The officer winked. Follow me and find out. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited for the final adventure of their road safety journey. Benny and Oliver followed the officer as dark clouds gathered in the sky. The wind started to blow, and a few raindrops splashed on the sidewalk. Uh-oh, it looks like a storm is coming, Benny said, hugging his toy car. The officer nodded. That's a great time to talk about road safety and bad weather. Do you know what happens when it rains a lot? Oliver thought for a second. The roads get wet? Exactly, the officer said. When roads are wet, cars can slide if they go too fast. That's why drivers need to slow down and be extra careful. Benny tilted his head. What if it's really, really stormy? If it's stormy, foggy, or too dark, drivers should turn on their headlights so other cars can see them, the officer said. And if it's too dangerous to drive, it's safest to pull over and wait until the storm passes. Oliver pointed at a big puddle on the road. What about big puddles? Great question, the officer said. Puddles can be deeper than they look. Cars should never drive through flooded streets because the water can carry them away. Benny gasped. That sounds scary. It can be, the officer said. That's why the rule is, turn around, don't drown. If a road is flooded, drivers should find another way. Oliver looked up. What about people walking? If you're walking or biking in the rain, always wear bright colors so cars can see you, the officer said. And never run across wet road. Cars take longer to stop when the ground is slippery. Benny nodded. So, if it's raining, we should walk carefully, wear bright clothes, and wait for cars to stop before crossing. The officer smiled. That's right. You boys are becoming road safety experts. Oliver grinned. I feel ready for any kind of weather. Benny pumped his fist. Me too. What can we learn next? The officer chuckled. How about one last surprise? Benny's eyes sparkled. A surprise? What is it? The officer winked. Follow me and find out. Benny and Oliver ran ahead, excited for the final adventure of their road safety journey. Benny and Oliver followed the officer with big smiles. They had learned so much about road safety: crosswalks, stop signs, traffic lights, bike rules, stranger danger, and even bad weather. But now, the officer had a surprise. Do you boys want to see something really cool? The officer asked with a wink. Yes, Benny and Oliver cheered. The officer led them to his shiny police car parked nearby. It had bright lights on top and big words that said police on the side. Benny's eyes went wide. Whoa, a real police car! Oliver gasped. Can we go inside? The officer grinned. Of course. But first, do you remember why police officers use cars? Benny nodded quickly. To keep the roads safe, Oliver added. And to help people who need it. Exactly, the officer said. We use sirens and flashing lights to warn cars to slow down or pull over when someone isn't following the rules. Benny grinned. Like when drivers go too fast in school zones. Right again, the officer said. Now, hop in. Benny and Oliver climbed into the front seat. The dashboard was full of buttons, screens, and a radio. The officer pressed a button. Whoop! The siren made a short sound and the boys laughed. This is so cool, Oliver said, gripping the steering wheel. Pretend driving. The officer chuckled. Remember, police cars help keep everyone safe. Drivers, bikers, and kids like you. Benny smiled. I'll always follow the rules. Oliver nodded. Me too. And I'll help remind others too. The officer high-fived both boys. That's what I like to hear. You two are officially road safety champions. Benny and Oliver beamed. They climbed out of the police car, still buzzing with excitement. Thank you for teaching us so much, Benny said. Oliver grinned. Yeah, road safety is awesome. The officer smiled. You're welcome, boys. Stay safe and always stop, look, and listen. As Benny and Oliver walked home, they couldn't stop talking about everything they had learned. They knew they would always follow the rules because being safe was the best adventure of all. The end.